The fingerprint database does not care about declarations of death. It does not read court orders or consult probate records or acknowledge the legal paperwork that says a man stopped existing in 1992. It only compares loops and whorls and arches against what it already knows. And in the spring of 2020, when a technician in Portland, Oregon ran a batch reconciliation of unmatched prints collected from crime scenes across a 3-year window, the database found something that, by every official record in existence, was not possible. A dead man had touched a display case in a pawn shop on Southeast Stark Street. A dead man who had been living 40 minutes outside Portland under a different name for the better part of 3 decades. His real name was Robert Allen Ware. And the last time anyone who knew that name had seen him, he was 38 years old, and his boat was drifting empty on Lake Coeur d'Alene. Bobby Ware grew up in Spokane, Washington, the second of 4 children, in a family that moved frequently and argued often. He was, by most accounts from people who knew him in his 20s and 30s, a man of surface-level charm and interior difficulty. The kind of person who made a strong first impression and gradually revealed himself to be someone harder to be around than he initially appeared. He worked construction, occasionally sales. Nothing that lasted long. He drank more than he should have. He had a temper that he managed in public and did not manage at home. In 1989, he began a relationship with a woman named Cynthia Marsh. She was 31 years old, worked as a dental hygienist in a Spokane clinic, had a daughter from a previous relationship, and a small apartment on the north side of the city. People who knew Cynthia in that period have described someone who was warm and deliberate and careful. The kind of person who thought about things before she said them, who was protective of her daughter above everything else. Her mother later said that Cynthia had spoken about ending the relationship with Ware in the months before her death, that she had been trying to figure out how. She never got the chance. On the morning of March 4, 1992, a neighbor called Spokane police after noticing that Cynthia's door was standing open. Officers arrived to find Cynthia Marsh dead inside her apartment. She was 34 years old. Her daughter was at her father's house and had not been present. The investigation that followed identified Robert Ware as a person of interest almost immediately. A neighbor had seen his truck outside the building on the evening of March 3rd, and Cynthia's sister told investigators that Bobby had called her multiple times in the days prior, that the relationship had been deteriorating, that there had been an argument. Detectives went looking for Robert Ware. He was already gone. On March 9, 1992, 5 days after Cynthia Marsh was found, a boat registered to Robert Allen Ware was discovered adrift on Lake Coeur d'Alene in northern Idaho, approximately 40 miles east of Spokane. There was no one aboard. There was a life jacket on the seat, a tackle box, a half-eaten sandwich. The engine was off. Nothing indicated a struggle or emergency. The lake was searched by the Kootenai County Sheriff's Marine Unit over the following 2 days. No body was recovered. Spokane investigators were notified. They drove to Idaho. They looked at the boat. They interviewed marina staff and nearby property owners. They found no witnesses to whatever had happened on the water. Without a body, they could not formally close either case. Not the disappearance, not the murder investigation, which remained technically open with Ware listed as a person of interest rather than a named suspect. But the operational reality was that their primary suspect appeared to have drowned himself in an Idaho lake, and without him alive to charge, and a case built enough to survive a trial, the Cynthia Marsh investigation was quietly shelved within a year. In 1995, Robert Allen Ware was declared legally dead by a Spokane County probate court, a petition filed by a distant relative managing his sparse estate. There was no funeral. There was no one particularly grief-stricken. The declaration was a legal formality, a piece of paper that said, "This man is no longer a problem for the living to concern themselves with." Cynthia Marsh's family received no such paperwork, no resolution, no trial, no verdict. Just a file in a cabinet, and the understanding that the man who had likely killed their daughter and sister had died before he could be made to answer for it. Her mother said in an interview years later that she had tried to accept it, that she had not been able to. Robert Ware had not drowned. The boat, the timing, the apparent accident, it had all been deliberate. He had driven to the marina, put the boat in the water, motored out far enough to make the disappearance plausible, and stepped off onto a dock he had scouted in advance. He had a bag, he had cash, saved over several months, an amount small enough not to draw attention. He had a name, David Farrell, assembled from the identity of a man who had died in infancy in Oregon in 1958. A technique that was easier to execute in the pre-digital years of the early 1990s than it would become later. He had been planning his exit before Cynthia Marsh was dead, which means something about the premeditation involved that investigators would note explicitly in their eventual case filings. He took a bus to Eugene, Oregon that same day. He rented a room under the Farrell name. He found construction work within 2 weeks. He paid cash for everything he could, avoided anything that required a background check he couldn't talk his way through, and kept his circle of acquaintances deliberately shallow. He did not apply for a driver's license for 3 years. He did not open a bank account for 5. He lived in the controlled, cautious way of a man who understood that any system he touched could be the one that surfaced him. He was, by the assessment of people who knew David Farrell in Eugene and later in the Portland suburb of Gresham, where he eventually settled, an unremarkable presence. He kept to himself. He was polite at a distance. He worked. He did not form close friendships. He did not have sustained relationships. He was the kind of person a neighborhood contains without really knowing, seen at the hardware store, nodded at over a fence, otherwise unregistered. He lived that way for 27 years. He was 65 years old by the time the database found him. The pawn shop on Southeast Stark Street was burglarized in October of 2019. A display case was broken, several items taken, and a set of partial prints was lifted from the shattered glass. The prints were logged, processed, and run through AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system, and returned no match. They were entered into the unsolved case queue and moved on from. The match came through an entirely different mechanism. In early 2020, the Oregon State Police implemented a supplemental reconciliation protocol, running batches of unresolved prints against expanded historical records, including pre-digital scan archives that had been converted and uploaded to the federal system on a rolling basis over the preceding several years. Among those archives were the fingerprint cards taken during low-level arrests in Washington state going back to the mid-1980s. Robert Allen Ware had been arrested for a misdemeanor disorderly conduct charge in Spokane in 1991. His prints had been inked and carded in the analog way of that era. Those cards had been digitized as part of a Washington state archiving project in 2018. When the batch reconciliation ran in March of 2020, the print from the pawn shop display case matched the left index finger of Robert Allen Ware. A man with no active record in any database. A man last officially recorded as deceased in a 1995 probate filing. A man whose name produced, when searched, a thin trail that terminated at an empty boat on a cold Idaho lake. The Portland field office of the FBI was notified. Spokane PD was notified. The Cynthia Marsh file was pulled from storage. It took investigators 8 months to find him. David Farrell, as he was still known to everyone around him, had moved from Gresham to a small property near Sandy, Oregon, approximately 25 miles east of Portland, in 2014. He owned the property outright, purchased with cash accumulated over decades of under-the-table construction work and, investigators later confirmed, a modest ongoing fraud scheme involving false contractor invoices that he had been running quietly for years. He had become, in his retirement from physical labor, a small-scale criminal who apparently could not stop operating outside the law even when the stakes were low and the risk unnecessary. That scheme was, in fact, how he was identified without tipping him off. Investigators pursuing the fraud angle made contact with one of his former clients under a pretext that gave nothing away, obtained a discarded coffee cup from outside a shop he frequented, and ran as Dina. The Dina was compared against a biological sample recovered from Cynthia Marsh's apartment in 1992. A sample that had been stored at the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for 28 years and had survived well enough for modern analysis. The match was not a question. On November 14, 2020, a date that was 28 years and 255 days after Cynthia Marsh was found dead in her apartment, Robert Allen Ware was arrested on his property near Sandy, Oregon. He gave his name as David Farrell. The FBI agent who made the arrest later said that when he told the man his actual name, there was a pause. Not surprise exactly, but something more like recognition. Like a door he had kept locked for 28 years had simply been opened by someone with the right key, and there was nothing left to do but stand in the frame. He was extradited to Spokane. He was charged with murder in the first degree. The trial of Robert Allen Ware took place in Spokane County Superior Court in the spring of 2022. He was 68 years old. He had spent more of his life as David Farrell than as Bobby Ware. He sat at the defense table and listened to 30 years of reconstructed evidence, the neighbor who had seen his truck, the sister's account of the deteriorating relationship, the Dina from the apartment, the fingerprint from the pawn shop that had been the first thread pulled, the testimony of forensic genealogists and crime lab analysts who explained to the jury, methodically and without drama, how a man who had been legally dead for 27 years had been scientifically located by the specificity of his own skin cells. His defense raised questions about the integrity of the decades-old biological sample. They challenged the chain of custody of certain evidence. They did what defense attorneys are obligated to do. The jury deliberated for 2 days and returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Robert Allen Ware was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will die, in all probability, in a Washington State correctional facility. He will die as Robert Ware. Whatever David Farrell was, the quiet neighbor, the cash-paying contractor, the man no one quite knew, that person has been dissolved by a court record and a fingerprint database and 28 years of preserved evidence waiting for the technology to catch up to what it needed to say. Cynthia Marsh's daughter, who was a young child when her mother was killed and is now in her late 30s, gave a victim impact statement at sentencing. She spoke for 12 minutes. She did not address the defendant. She spoke only about her mother, about who she was, about what it had meant to grow up without her, about the particular cruelty of spending a childhood being told that the man responsible had probably drowned in a lake, and that this was the closest thing to justice that was available. She said that she had spent years trying to make peace with that. She was glad she had failed. There is something deeply strange about a fingerprint. It is not something a person chooses to leave. It is not a statement, not a confession, not a mistake born of carelessness. It is simply the residue of existing, of picking something up, of touching the world the way all living things touch the world, without intention, without thought. Robert Ware touched a display case in a pawn shop in Portland because he was there, and it was there, and that is what hands do. He had spent 28 years being careful. He had spent 28 years not being Robert Ware. And none of it, not a single one of those years, not a single precaution or constructed lie or careful distance could change the fact that he had once pressed his finger to an ink card in a Spokane jail in 1991 and left behind a record of exactly who he was. That record waited. It had no urgency, no agenda. It simply held the information. And when the right question was finally asked of the right database at the right moment, it answered. Cynthia Marsh was 34 years old. She was trying to figure out how to leave. She had a daughter she was protecting and a life she was still in the process of constructing, and a mother who would spend the next 3 decades going to sleep without knowing who was going to answer for what had happened to her child. She deserved someone to answer. Now, someone has. Say her name. Cynthia Marsh. Let it be the one that stays with you.